A very warm welcome to all of you. You're watching Gravitas with me, Priyanka Sharma. Let's get started. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit has wrapped up. In the last 2 days, we've talked about the changing dynamics in the world order. We've told you about the significance of the summit as a counterforce to a Western alliance. But remember, this summit took place in the shadow of the Ukraine war. And that war is now costing Vladimir Putin. Tonight, on Gravitas, we'll put the spotlight on the Russian leader and tell you about his changing equation with the two most powerful members at the summit, India and China. Putin has told India's Prime Minister, and listen to this, he hopes to end the war as soon as possible.
Opposition to the conflict in Ukraine. उसके विषय में जरूर आज हमें चर्चा करने का मौका मिलेगा. हर पल एक दूसरे के साथ.
Let's dive right in. Until this week, Vladimir Putin was known as a symbol of Russian power. That's the image he had created for himself, how we all saw him. The word power described all his actions, whether it was the display of his masculinity, the exercise routines, the shirtless excursions, the judo moves. Statesman Putin showcased his power too. The power walks through the halls of the Kremlin, the signaling of intent through rallies. When he scolded his colleagues, Putin didn't flinch for even a second.
В противном случае мы должны принять то решение, о котором сегодня говорится. Что значит, в противном случае вы предлагаете начать переговорный процесс? Нет, я или признавать суверенитет. А я говорите прямо. Я поддержу предложение о признании. Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей. Поддерживаю предложение. Так и скажите, да или нет.
That was Putin in February, just before the invasion of Ukraine. He was scolding his spy chief. That's the Vladimir Putin we know. The man who has ruled Russia with an iron fist. But this week at the SCO summit, Putin looked like a completely different man. His demeanor remains the same, but the Russian president doesn't sound confident. For the last 2 days, Putin has found himself repeatedly defending his actions in Ukraine. Yesterday, it was Xi Jinping, and today it was India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. There is a marked shift in the Russian president's tone. He is reassuring allies that the war will end soon. He's answering questions and addressing concerns. Has the war in Ukraine cornered Russia and its powerful leader? This is our cover story tonight on Gravitas. We'll start with the latest, the Putin-Modi bilateral. It happened on the sidelines of the SCO summit. The setting was cordial. Prime Minister Modi walked towards Putin. Both leaders shook hands, but once they sat down to talk, the mood changed. Prime Minister Modi began by thanking Ukraine and Russia for the support during the initial days of the war. And then the Indian Prime Minister said this.
आज का युग युद्ध का है नहीं और हमने फोन पर भी कई बार आपसे इस विषय में बात की है कि डेमोक्रेसी और डिप्लोमेसी और डायलॉग ये सारी बातें ऐसी हैं कि जो दुनिया को एक स्पर्श करती है. आने वाले दिनों में शांति के रास्ते पर हम कैसे बढ़ सके उसके विषय में जरूर आज हमें चर्चा करने का मौका मिलेगा.
Today's era is not an era for war. Diplomacy and dialogue is the way forward. The message from the Indian Prime Minister was unambiguous. He asked Russia for a cessation in hostilities, a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. So the question is, how did Putin respond to that? Well, with a word of assurance, a guarantee of sorts, Putin told Prime Minister Modi that Russia will do everything it can to stop the war.
I know your stance on the conflict in Ukraine. I know about the concerns that you voice constantly. We will do everything for it to stop as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the leadership of the opposing side, Ukraine, has stated that they refuse to hold talks and that they want to reach their goals militarily, or as they say, on the battlefield.
It's quite clear Putin was shifting the blame on Ukraine for a bit, but let's focus on his choice of words. We want all of this to end as soon as possible. In April, the Russian president was threatening a lightning offensive in Ukraine. Somehow, Putin no longer sounds that confident anymore. Yesterday, he gave a similar reassurance to his most important ally, China. Yes, the war in Ukraine is testing the no-limits partnership. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin met Xi Jinping. We had told you about this on the show. The meeting happened, of course, on the sidelines of the summit. Many had predicted the Chinese president will reaffirm his support to his Russian counterpart. But a comment from Putin has taken everyone by surprise. It seems like the Chinese leadership is having doubts about the Russians' offensive in Ukraine. Listen in.
We highly value the balanced position of our Chinese friends when it comes to the Ukraine crisis. We understand your questions and concern about this. During today's meeting, we will of course explain our position.
We understand your questions. We understand your concerns. We will of course explain our position. That sounded quite like a reassurance. So why did Putin feel the need to reassure Xi? What is China concerned about? Beijing is avoiding all these questions about this comment. The Chinese press didn't carry Putin's statement at all in its reports. Isn't that curious? That statement was missing from the press releases of the Chinese government altogether. Look at this. This is the official press release about the Xi-Putin bilateral. It comes from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. However, there is no mention of Ukraine. No mention of the no-limits partnership either. So what has changed? Perhaps China doesn't like the fact that the war has dragged on for more than 7 months now. It is a known fact that Beijing has been feeling uneasy about the escalating conflict. Recently, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang gave his assessment, and he said that China is deeply worried about the crisis in Ukraine. In fact, I have that statement with me right now. Here is what the Chinese Premier said. On Ukraine, indeed, the current situation there is grave, and China is deeply concerned and grieved. The pressing task now is preventing tensions from escalating or even getting out of control. Let's give you some context now. That means that Beijing too prefers a diplomatic solution. But after recent events, a diplomatic settlement is out of question. Ukraine has launched a counter-offensive. Kiev says it has retaken some 6,000 square miles of territory. The Russian parliament is considering summoning the defense minister. The lawmakers want to quiz him about the setbacks. So there is scrutiny at home, but that shouldn't affect Putin in any way. There is no sign of any major dissent against the offensive in Ukraine. A survey came out last month. More than 80% of the Russians support Putin, but the scrutiny of Russia's war is certainly growing outside. So what does that mean for Vladimir Putin's stature on the international stage? After the SCO summit, the strong man of Russia suddenly looks weakened. Let's move on. While India's Prime Minister came with ideas and proposals, Pakistan's Prime Minister came with appeals. Frankly, you can't blame him. Pakistan's economy is going through a rough patch. Actually, rough patch is an understatement. Their inflation is almost at 27%. Their foreign exchange reserves are down to $8.6 billion. And almost one-third of the country is flooded. So Shehbaz Sharif had no option but to appeal. He was visibly emotional during his address at the SCO roundtable. Take a look.
I've been in public life for the last 40 years. I have never seen with my eyes this kind of terrible devastation. It is catastrophic, of proportions unknown to the people of Pakistan, and of course, by extension, to the entire world.
You heard him, and I have to say, full marks for honesty. In fact, a few days back, Shehbaz Sharif was feeling even more honest. He was addressing a convention of lawyers in Pakistan. Let me quote what he said. Today, when we go to any friendly country or make a phone call, they think that we have come to beg for money. He goes on, actually. We have been wandering for the past 75 years carrying a begging bowl. Coming from the Prime Minister, that's a huge admission. He says Pakistan has been carrying a begging bowl for 75 years. Do you know what we call such countries? Basket cases. They don't have a functioning economy. Instead, they survive on aid and loans. So the question is, how does Pakistan plan to solve this crisis? Initially, they were betting on a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Earlier this month, the IMF approved the first payment, around $1.17 billion. But that was before the devastation caused by the floods. Now, the situation has changed. Almost one-third of the country is flooded. Around 1,400 people have died, and almost 500,000 are living in temporary shelters. Close to 1 million homes have been completely destroyed. The total damages? At last count, almost $30 billion. That's around 10% of Pakistan's GDP. Recovering from this crisis will be a massive challenge. And I underline the word massive. Pakistan alone simply cannot save its economy. It will need assistance from the UN agencies along with partner countries. So what does that mean? The begging bowl will have to come out again. Even their proteges are abandoning them. I'm talking about the Taliban. Pakistan's deep state created the Taliban in the 1990s. They helped the Taliban conquer Kabul twice. But are they returning the favor? Well, far from it. The Taliban have snubbed Pakistan more than once, and this week, things got ugly. There was a gunfight at the Afpak border. Taliban fighters clashed with the Pakistani soldiers. Over what? Well, that depends which side you ask. The Taliban claimed that Pakistan was building military outposts near the border. Time now for a quick side note. The border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is called the Durand Line. It was drawn up in the 1890s by the British colonial officers. Pakistan accepts this line, but Afghanistan does not. In fact, no Afghan government can ever recognize the Durand Line, not even the Taliban. Coming back to these clashes now, Pakistan has a different version about what happened. Listen to this. Terrorists from inside Afghanistan across the international border opened fire on Pakistani troops. Two things to note here. Number one, Pakistan doesn't refer to the Taliban fighters or soldiers. They are instead calling them terrorists. Number two, they admitted to casualties. Pakistan says 3 of its soldiers were killed in the firing. Now, this is not an isolated incident. Tensions have been rising between Pakistan and Taliban for a while now. In April, Pakistan launched airstrikes on Afghan territory. Around 47 people were killed and 23 injured. This week, we had another face-off over Masood Azhar. The 2611 mastermind is believed to be living in Pakistan, but Islamabad denies this. Their government says that Azhar could be in Afghanistan. What's more, they're asking the Taliban to arrest him. The response from Kabul was swift. They denied the charge and asked Pakistan for proof. So why are Pakistan and the Taliban sparring? We can think of 3 reasons. Let's tell you. Number 1, the Taliban's refusal to recognize the Durand Line. Because of that, the border is porous. There is illegal migration, cross-border terrorism. Simply put, it is almost like the Wild West. And reason number 2, the Taliban's unwillingness to help with the TTP. The TTP refers to the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, basically Pakistan's version of the Afghan Taliban. And their goal is to overthrow the regime in Islamabad. They want to impose Sharia law in Pakistan. So where does Kabul figure in this conflict? The Afghan Taliban has considerable influence over the TTP. There are ethnic links. There are familial relations. Yet the Taliban has refused to use that influence to rein in the TTP. And this has irked Islamabad. And finally, let's now come to reason number 3. The Taliban doesn't really need Pakistan. That wasn't the case during their first stint in power. In the 1990s, Pakistan was a key Western ally in South Asia. They had endless financial and military support. Now, not so much. Like Shehbaz Sharif said, Pakistan is out with the begging bowl. At the same time, the Taliban have discovered new options. China, for one, is cozying up to them, and so is Russia. Remember, Russia actually fought against the Taliban during their first stint in power, but now they are partners. Which now brings us to the all-important question. Has the Pakistan-Taliban relationship run its course? In theory, perhaps. But on the ground, Pakistan has long-standing networks. They have considerable clout over the Haqqani faction of the Taliban, so this relationship may not end soon. But the power disparities have narrowed. Just like Afghanistan, Pakistan too is now dependent on aid and loans, as they say. Proxy politics is expensive. And the situation could get worse for them, which brings us to our next story. The World Bank has put out a dire prediction. It affects all of us. It believes that the global economy may fall into a recession next year. These reports are released frequently. They give us a sense or a broad assessment of the global economy. While the fears of a global recession are not new, many experts were optimistic that a soft landing is possible. But this latest assessment is now sounding like an alarm. We might be getting closer to a recession. So here now are some quick takeaways from that World Bank report. The global economy is facing a steep slowdown, something we haven't seen since the 1970s. A series of problems have created this situation. High inflation for one. Supply chain problems, tighter market conditions where investments have slowed down. These are all contributing to this. There are three economies that are dragging growth down in particular: the United States, China, and the Eurozone. The slowdown there is impacting everyone. We all know how we got here. It began with the pandemic, when the world went into a lockdown. Governments intensified spending. They pumped money into the economy to prevent a complete collapse. Citizens and businesses were given stimulus to make sure that they can survive and sustain themselves during the pandemic. Banks were asked to intensify lending. Central banks decided to cut interest rates, so there was more money in the system essentially. But this year, the Russian invasion of Ukraine triggered a cost of living crisis. There was a shortage of essentials, from food to fuel. And wherever there is a shortage, the prices go up naturally. And that's why inflation rates around the world shot up. Central banks rushed to tame the situation. They increased interest rates. It has made borrowing more expensive. So effectively, central banks are trying to squeeze the excess money out of the system now. And that's what the World Bank is concerned about. The higher the interest rates, they could trigger a global recession. Now, don't get me wrong. Central banks are using a tried and tested tool to tame inflation. But it is rather a double-edged sword. Because if you don't make adequate cuts, inflation gets out of hand. And if you make sweeping cuts, it could slow down the economy altogether. The challenge is to find the right balance. So how are the central banks faring? Are they doing too much or too little? The World Bank says that the rate cuts go so far may not be sufficient. This might not be able to bring down inflation. Global core inflation rate could stay above 5% in the year 2023. And that is almost double of the 5-year average before the pandemic. This estimate doesn't include energy prices, and we all know how even a minor fluctuation on that front can impact inflation. So interest rates could rise further. The World Bank is suggesting an increase of 2 percentage points, which means that growth rates will slow down further. Already a slowdown is visible. Earlier, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, revised its growth estimates. It predicted the global economy will grow by 3.2% this year and 2.9% next year. But the IMF is a little more optimistic in its projections. It says some countries will slip into a recession next year. But it is too early to say if the entire global economy would be affected. Investors are not taking any chances, however. Indian markets crashed today. The Sensex fell by over 1,000 points and the Nifty by over 300 points. Next week, central banks of the United States and the United Kingdom are expected to increase interest rates yet again. And we, of course, will keep a track of all these developments. Let's move on to our next story, which is about Kamala Harris. This morning, she received some uninvited guests. A group of more than 100 illegal migrants. They assembled outside her residence looking for food, shelter, and jobs. They were moved there from Texas by the state's governor himself. Why? To corner the US Vice President. You see, Kamala Harris is America's so-called border czar. She's in charge of illegal migrants entering the country. But she recently claimed that the issue had subsided, that American borders were now safe and guarded. So the Republicans decided to give her a reality check. And here's a report on what happened next. Take a look.
These images are from Washington, D.C. What you see is a group of illegal migrants assembled outside the U.S. Naval Observatory. the official residence of Kamala Harris. They were bussed here from Texas by the state's Republican governor to corner the U.S. vice president. Why did he do this? Because Kamala Harris is America's so-called border czar, the Biden administration's point person for illegal migrants, a role which Republicans say she has completely abandoned. In a recent interview, Harris claimed that American borders are safe, a questionable claim given the colossal surge in illegal migrant arrests. Look at the numbers. America apprehended more than 200,000 illegal migrants in July this year. This is 340% higher than the average arrests in July in the last 5 years. Analysts say if the trend persists, there will be more than 2 million migrants behind bars by the end of 2022. Where are these migrants coming from? Mostly from Colombia, Panama, Guyana, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. Where are they being arrested? Mostly in the states of Florida, Mississippi, Texas, and Arizona, all of which happen to be governed by Republicans. So what do the Republicans do? They send migrants to the vice president's doorstep in order to pressure Democrats into doing their job. More than 100 of them were dropped outside her home in a clear bid to expose Kamala Harris's claims.
I left Venezuela on August 18th. I passed through the jungle. I spent 6 days in the jungle.
Cuba, Nicaragua, Nicaragua, Honduras, Honduras, Guatemala, Guatemala, Mexico. And in Mexico it got ugly. Anything unpleasant that can happen to a human being happens to migrants.
Interestingly, Texas is not the only state pulling off this stunt. The state of Florida is doing something similar. On Thursday, it sent a plane filled with migrants to an island governed by Democrats, Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, a vacation spot for the rich and affluent. Also for elite American lawmakers, the island happens to be governed by Republicans. Florida wants them to host illegal migrants too. The governor of Florida is unapologetic about his move. He says it's about time that Joe Biden lives up to his promises.
So our message is, we're not a sanctuary state. We don't have benefits or any of that. There are some sanctuary jurisdictions, and that would be better. Now, what would be the best is for Biden to do his damn job and secure the border.
The Democrats are calling this stunt evil, inhumane, and un-American. They're accusing Republicans of exploiting the plight of migrants and using them as political pawns.
We get it. It's a fundamental long-term issue. It is a broken system, but we are also doing the work. And I have to say, the work that what we're seeing Republicans doing, elected officials using migrants as a pawn, is not the way to move forward on this.
Why send these folks only to blue cities or blue states? Why isn't Abbott sending refugees to Mississippi or Oklahoma or Idaho? This is about politics for him, without regard to the fear and anguish and the challenges that it poses for these refugees.
This fiasco is expected to escalate further because midterm elections are round the corner. Joe Biden's electoral prospects don't look so good. So his team is using issues such as abortion to gain political dividends. To counter their campaign, the Republicans have decided to latch on to the issues of migrants. They've made their first big move. Who knows what might come next? Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Let's now shift our focus to Britain now. In 48 hours from now, Britain's former monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, will finally be laid to rest. And as I speak, thousands are queuing up outside Westminster Hall to catch a final glimpse of the Queen's coffin and pay their respects. But officials from one country have been barred from doing so: China. Reports say a Chinese delegation has been banned from viewing the Queen's coffin. Why? Our next report tells you.
These images are from Westminster Hall. What you see are mourners queuing in lines to get a glimpse of Queen Elizabeth's coffin. The lines stretch for tens of miles, with thousands waiting for hours at stretch. On Friday, the crowds grew so big that the queue had to be halted for 6 hours. Shortly after it resumed, members of parliament, the mayor of London, former prime ministers, and foreign dignitaries, they were all seen paying their respects to the Queen, but one foreign delegation was surprisingly banned from doing so. China. Reports claim a Chinese delegation was recently barred from viewing Queen Elizabeth's coffin. That its request to enter Westminster Hall was refused by the House of Commons Speaker Lindsay Hoyle. The question is, why? The answer is China itself, its record on human rights abuses, its heavy-handed style of diplomacy, and its strained relations with the UK. Last year, China imposed unwarranted travel bans and froze the assets of 9 Britons, including 7 parliamentarians. Why? Because these parliamentarians had accused Beijing of mistreating Uyghur Muslims. So China responded with bluster, and the UK paid in kind. Last year, it banned the Chinese ambassador from entering the British Parliament. This year, it has banned Chinese officials from paying respects to the Queen. That's not all. Tory MPs are also asking the British government to withdraw an invitation to Xi Jinping to attend Queen Elizabeth's funeral. This royal snub has upset Beijing. It's reminding the British about protocol, asking them to treat all guests properly.
Foreign delegations participating in the event upon invitation from the United Kingdom is a sign of respect to the Queen and the importance accorded to the United Kingdom. As the host, the United Kingdom should uphold diplomatic protocols and proper manners to guests.
Britain's attitude towards China is likely to harden in the months ahead. The new British Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has already vowed to be more hawkish towards Beijing. And for whatever it's worth, the new British monarch is also not too fond of China. In 2015, he conspicuously skipped a state banquet for the Chinese president. In 2008, he boycotted the Beijing Olympics, citing his support for Tibet. In 2005, he missed another state banquet for Chinese President Hu Jintao. And in 1997, right after Hong Kong's handover to Beijing, Charles described Chinese leaders as appalling old waxworks. It's hard to say if he will soften his stance as the monarch, but his disdain for the Chinese leadership is well established. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Our next story is about smoking. You heard that right, smoking. You know, smokers often ask themselves what really is the big deal with smoking a cigarette. Their argument is simple. Smokers often lead a long and happy life, whereas a lot of those who abstain are diagnosed with cancer. Now, while that may be true, in no way does that suggest that you should smoke. And we certainly are not encouraging you to. Far from it, in fact. I want to tell you about a very interesting report that I read the other day. It said that your smoking habits can be deadly, not just for you, but also your next generation and the generation after. Simply put, your grandchildren can suffer the consequences of you smoking a cigarette. Let that sink in. I'm guessing you're wondering, what kind of consequences are we talking about? Well, lung problems to begin with. Even asthma. Look at what this study says. A child is 59% more at the risk of non-allergic asthma if his father is exposed to second-hand smoking in childhood. So what's second-hand smoking? The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention defines it as the combination of smoke from the burning end of a cigarette and the smoke breathed out by smokers. Basically, second-hand smoking is what you call passive smoking. So that's 59% risk of non-allergic asthma if the father was a passive smoker in his childhood. But what if the father was a smoker? Well, then the risk of non-allergic asthma in the child jumps to 72%. What you must note at this point is that we are talking about exposure to smoke during the father's childhood, meaning when he was 15 years or younger. In most cases, the exposure is second-hand, The grandfather is smoking, so the father ends up passive smoking, and then his children suffer the consequences. If it sounds complicated to you, I will explain it in simpler words. Basically, the study says you can have non-allergic asthma because your grandfather was a smoker. You can also have non-allergic asthma when your father was a smoker. Think about that. Now, have you noticed we have been talking about only a particular gender here, about fathers and not mothers? Well, that is what else is very interesting about this study, something I want to focus on. It finds that the transgenerational effect is applicable only to males, meaning a child will bear the consequences or the burden of his father's smoking habits or his grandfather's, not the grandmothers or the mothers. So does this mean women are cleared to smoke? Again, no way are we suggesting that. Women have their own unique battle with smoking. The study that I was referring to was published in the European Respiratory Journal. Now look at what the CDC says. 1. Mothers who smoke are more likely to deliver their babies early, basically what we call a preterm delivery. It is often linked to disability, even the death of a newborn. Let's come to the second point. Mothers who are exposed to secondhand smoking when pregnant are most likely to have low birth weight babies. And what about mothers who smoke during pregnancy? In such cases, the babies have 20% chance of a low birth weight. And it gets worse. Look at point number 3 now. Studies show that babies are more likely to die from SIDS or sudden infant death syndrome if the mother smokes directly or passively during her pregnancy. Coming to point number 4, these babies are also more likely to have weaker lungs. What does this tell you? Your smoking habits may not affect you, but it will take a toll on your next generation, and this is regardless of what your gender is. And if you are a male, the price is passed on to even the grandchildren. So this essentially is a transgenerational threat. In fact, I would even say it's an epidemic, one that is being passed from one generation to another. Let me show you some numbers now. Tobacco kills more than 8 million people every year. 7 million of these deaths are because of direct tobacco consumption, the rest because of second-hand tobacco consumption. So if you also smoke, and if you've asked yourself this question, what really is the big deal about smoking? Well, you should now have your answer. Stop smoking. If not for your sake, at least for the sake of your family. Think about that as we move on to our next story. I want to talk about the biggest story from sports now. Roger Federer's retirement. We briefly touched upon his legacy yesterday. Today we will focus on what lies ahead. First, the reactions. All the top tennis stars lined up to congratulate Federer on a great career, including Serena Williams. Williams herself retired earlier this month. She posted this message on social media. Let me quote from that. I applaud you and look forward to all that you do in the future. Welcome to the retirement club and thank you for being you. Now, the entire message is very moving, a tribute from one great to another. But one particular phrase in that message got us thinking, the retirement club. Serena probably mentioned it casually, but if you think about it, the retirement club does truly exist, and chances are it is one of the richest clubs in the world. Let me explain. We know that athletes are among the highest paid people on earth. We also know that they retire early. Most athletes play until their late 30s, or if their body permits, maybe even their late 40s. But beyond that, you cannot stick around. Just think about any game, cricket, tennis, football, hockey. Most athletes hang up their boots by middle age. Do you see the problem here? If you retire in your 30s, how will you live out the rest of your life? Where will you earn money from? And this is precisely why people work till their 50s or 60s, because they need the income. But for athletes, that's not an option. Their body only permits them to play until middle age. So during their career, they must invest and plan wisely and enter the retirement club. Most athletes have a solid plan post-retirement. Take Federer, for example. In 2018, he signed a deal with the Japanese firm Uniqlo. Guess how much it was worth? $300 million over 10 years. In other words, $30 million per year. So Federer's future is pretty sorted, we would say, for this decade. He may not be playing professional tennis, but the money will keep rolling in. Let's bring you another example. George Foreman, one of the toughest boxers in sporting history. He lent his name to a cooking grill after retirement. And you can find the George Foreman grill on most e-commerce platforms. Guess how much he was paid for it? A cool $137 million. Remember, this is years after his retirement. And then, of course, we have Michael Jordan, arguably the greatest basketball player ever. He owns teams in the NBA and the NASCAR. He also presides over a vast empire of sneakers and wearables. Net worth, almost $1.7 billion. And of course, how can we forget golf? Have you heard about Arnold Palmer? If you are a golf enthusiast, you may have. But even if you are not, perhaps you have heard about the cocktail. Well, Arnold Palmer, the drink, is named after him. Palmer dominated golf in the 1960s. His total on-course earnings was $7 million. When he died in 2016, listen to this, his net worth was $700 million. This gives you an idea about this retirement club. Many athletes end up earning more after retirement. Sometimes it falls into place, but sometimes you have to plan for it. Tiger Woods belongs to the second category. You may have heard about the new golf league funded by Saudi Arabia. It is called Live Golf. It is basically challenging the PGA Tour. And reports say that Live Golf tried to get Tiger Woods on board. Guess how much they offered him? $700 to $800 million. But Woods turned it down. Instead, he's trying to revive the PGA Tour. He has brought top golfers together in a bid to challenge the Saudi League, sort of like a shadow commissioner. But the question is, what could he get in return? Perhaps a good chunk of the PGA's business. Reports say up to 10 or 15% of the profits even. That's nearly $750 million. Not a bad deal, right? Closer home, Indian athletes too have had solid retirement plans. Like Sachin Tendulkar. His net worth is almost $170 million. He has signed multiple endorsement deals with brands like BMW and Apollo Tyres. He has also started corporate ventures like the 100MB app. It curates content related to his life both on the field and, of course, off it. We could go on and on. The fact is, for many athletes, retirement is just the start of a new phase. Many of them earn more after retirement than before it. And the reason is quite simple. Players may retire, but brands do not. You see, Roger Federer is more than a tennis player. He is a recognizable and respectable brand, a bankable brand, as they say. And companies will always be willing to pay for that, no matter what the sum. Same with the likes of Michael Jordan, David Beckham, Peyton Manning, Shaquille O'Neal. All of them built a brand while playing the game, and after that, it was all about finding the right sweet deal. So the retirement club may lack the same excitement as the players' club, but the money is good, if not better. Moving on, in New York, as part of an effort to bring about more awareness about the Holocaust, museums will now be required to identify and disclose artworks and pieces stolen from the Jews during World War II, with a special signage and descriptions for items that have not yet been repatriated or reclaimed. We bring you a detailed report. Take a look.
During the Second World War, the Nazis left no stone unturned to try and wipe out Jewish culture and memorabilia. And as part of this effort, some 600,000 pieces of artwork were looted from the Jewish people. As the last generation of survivors slowly starts to dwindle, a significant number of these pieces and artworks remain unclaimed. But for many heirs of the survivors, these could potentially be the only remaining connection to their past.
People should be aware that of the terrible cost to people during World War II as these confiscations took place, and how people's treasures that they loved and that had been in their families were torn from them at the same time that the rest of their lives were being disrupted, and that we should honor their memory by letting people know that we recognize that these objects have within them this sense of the tragic moment that they have gone through.
New York is now attempting to reconcile. For the pieces that remain in museums, a new law has been passed.
all museums must now put up special signs to identify the pieces from the Nazi loot from 1933 through 1945. This is to bring in more awareness and to ensure that the public continues to be educated about the Holocaust. And to that effect, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has identified 53 such works.
So for us, we have traced about 53 such works in our collection, and they are online in our collections area of our website. Those are the works that we can say we know were stolen during World War II, but the original families got them back, and in a later period, they came into our collection. And those would be the ones that we would be bringing to people's attention through this new law.
The hope is that this new law will afford these pieces the recognition they deserve, and to bring to fore the stories these pieces hold, and in some cases, to even return them to their rightful owners. Bureau Report WION, World is One.
Now, before we wrap up tonight's show, I have a quick question for you. Do you know what date it is? The 16th of September, of course, but what is the significance of this day? Well, in India, the 16th of September is marked as National Engineers Day. First to history, the day marks the birth anniversary of India's first civil engineer. His name was Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya. He was born in Karnataka in 1861. Visvesvaraya had a very interesting education. He got a bachelor's degree in arts and then went on to study civil engineering. He then took up a job as an assistant engineer in Bombay's Public Works Department, and he went on to work with the Irrigation Department. In 1906, he was sent to Yemen, which was then Aden, to study water supply and drainage system. In 1908, Visvesvaraya became the chief engineer of the state of Mysore. We are talking about a time when Mysore was still a princely state. In 1912, he became the Diwan of Mysore. He founded the Mysore Soap Factory, developed a system to protect the Visakhapatnam port from sea erosion. He built a flood protection system for Hyderabad, also the Bank of Mysuru, the Mysore Iron and Steel Works, the Bangalore Agricultural University. He was also instrumental in the founding of the Government Engineering College in Bangalore. It is quite a long list. And for his contribution to nation building, Visvesvaraya was conferred with the Bharat Ratna, which of course is India's highest civilian award. And this was in the year 1955. Why am I telling you all this? Several decades later, engineering remains very close to the spirit of India, even to this day. In fact, the popular joke is, in India, a student's basic education is completed only after engineering. She could choose to be a journalist, a lawyer, a consultant, an actor, even a salesperson. But first, she must be an engineer. According to one estimate, India generated 1.3 million engineers globally. Some of them have made it big globally. We all talk about them. We write about them. They are leading some of the biggest tech companies around the world. Let me say a few names. Google CEO Sundar Pichai studied BTech from IIT Kharagpur. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella studied engineering at the Manipal Institute of Technology. Twitter CEO Parag Agrawal is an alumnus of IIT Bombay. So is FedEx CEO Raj Subramaniam. IBM's Arvind Krishna studied at IIT Kanpur. Back in India too, Indian engineers are the backbone of the country's thriving IT industry. But to be honest, it is not all rosy. India's engineering degree has lost its sheen over the years. While the country's premier colleges continue to hone some of the brightest minds, for the most part, Indian engineers fall short of the required skill. And I'm not saying this, the numbers are. An employability assessment company called Aspiring Minds published a report in 2019. It found that 80% of engineers in India are unfit to take up any job in the knowledge economy. The report further said that India's engineers lack the relevant digital skills, also advanced tech skills. I am talking about the likes of AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science, etc. The report further says only 1.5% of engineers in India have the skills required for new age jobs of today. These are certainly not flattering numbers. And for India, a country that prides itself in its engineers and engineering colleges, its engineering acumen, these numbers are bad news. If India is to preserve the spirit of engineering, rather preserve the spirit of top-notch engineering, it must start by reinventing engineering education altogether in the country. Bring it at par with global standards, factor in global changes, focus on research, focus more on skill development. This won't be an easy challenge, but it will be worth it, because just like Visvesvaraya, who helped in building modern India, today's engineers will be the ones building the digital India of the future, your future, my future. And on that note, let's now take a look at what made news around the world in Gravitas Global Headlines.
The UN Rights Commissioner says the body wants to send a team to Izium after mass graves were discovered from the eastern Ukrainian city reclaimed from Russian troops. Stock markets slide while the British pound tanks to a 37-year dollar low as weak UK retail sales stoke global recession fears. 5 Lebanese banks stormed by depositors seeking to unlock frozen savings, the latest in a string of heists in the crisis-hit country. The European Parliament declares Hungary not a full democracy, says the country is a hybrid regime which breached EU democratic norms in a symbolic vote against Viktor Orban's government. Reports say the Uber Technologies computer network was breached, resulting in tanking several internal communications and engineering systems offline. Hundreds of flights have been cancelled and thousands forced to change plans as French air traffic controllers took industrial action over pay. Starbucks Singapore says its customer database was breached online, with local media reporting that 200,000 people's information was stolen. Villages and fields completely submerged in water in the central Italian region of Marche after torrential rain overnight and flash floods killed at least 10. Serena Williams has hailed fellow tennis legend Roger Federer after his retirement decision. Serena, who herself has ended her career recently, said that she was among the millions that Federer inspired and welcomed the Swiss maestro to the retirement club. A jersey worn by Michael Jordan during the 1998 NBA Finals has attracted a record price of $10.1 million at an auction. The sum is the highest ever paid for a piece of sports clothing, eclipsing the $9.8 million paid for the shirt worn by Diego Maradona during the Hand of God game at the 1986 World Cup.
And with that, it's a wrap on Gravitas tonight. Thanks for watching the show with me, Priyanka Sharma. Have a great weekend ahead.